G'day everybody, and welcome to Product Tank Sydney. We're ashamed to say this is our first event of the year, but it's one that we've all been waiting for. So, without further ado, if you haven't been to a Product Tank event, then know that we're part of the largest community of product people on this planet. Meetups pretty much everywhere you go. And we've already seen in the stream, we've got people from all sorts of places with us today as well. Hi to Melbourne, Auckland, obviously Sydney, which is where we're based right now, the Product Tank Sydney HQ, makes sense. What do we have? Perth, Stockholm, awesome, and probably a few other places. So welcome. We are, as you know, Product Tank is, as you hopefully know, Product Tank is events that we run. Mind the Product is the organization that sits on top of us, and that has a really great community for people, as well as a conference that runs every year, maybe even a couple of times a year, I think. Keep an eye out. There's always awesome content on the Mind the Product page and the blog. And that leads to our next part. If you want to be part of the Product Tank community, of course, you can get involved as a speaker. That's my email address. Just ping me, and we'll find a time and a topic and make it happen. If and when the whole COVID thing is done, and then we can host in-person events as well, and sponsor Product Tank events like we've done for many years before here in Sydney. For the time being, we just keep everyone safe and stay online. You can write on Mind the Product. And in fact, Brendan, our speaker today, has published an article there, which you should look up. And you can join the Mind the Product community as well on the site. Now, these events wouldn't happen without some people sort of putting in their spare time outside of work into these events. We're all volunteers. I'm a Chief Product Officer and Product Advisor around Sydney. Liam is the Director of Bright Books Consulting, and Peter Chewy is a Growth and Product Lead at Cognizant. And we're working hard behind the scenes to get the best product people that we know from around the community to share some of their best practices or learnings with everyone else, so you guys can do things better than maybe we did the next day. Now, today's about storytelling, and essentially how an ex-Spotify PM learned to love it. And while that's a little bit of a catchy title, it doesn't actually do Brendan any justice. He's worked with so many organizations today. He's working with Organa today, and Spotify is really just one of the stations that he worked at. But if you find him online, you can check out his profile as well. Brendan is someone who's got so much to share, and we're so lucky to have him. And without further ado, I want to bring up Brendan and tell us about storytelling, a little bit of his history at Spotify and a few other things. And I hope, I know, because I've seen some of the talk, that you're going to have lots and lots of things to learn and to apply tomorrow when you go back to work, or if you're in Europe, later today in your day. Awesome. Welcome, Brandon, and over to you.
Thanks a lot for having me, Ben. And thank you, everyone that is here, for coming along. It's really strange because I can't see any of you right now, so I just have to assume that you're there. But so my name's Brendan Marsh. I work for a consulting company called Organa, and I am going to talk a little bit about storytelling and my experience with it. So I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to talk about storytelling today and why it's an important skill to learn in product management. To do this, I'm going to tell you my story because, folks, I wasn't born a storyteller. So as a kid, throughout primary school and high school, I was bullied for most of my childhood. So instead of hanging out with the cool kids, I was inside playing video games with my very few nerdy friends and tinkering with my 486 computer. And I hated school. Instead of being inspired about the possibilities of the future, I was simply doing what I could to get by day. I only scraped into university due to pretty poor grades. And funnily enough, it was English that I struggled most with, and it almost stopped me from getting into university. But when I finally got there, I studied a Bachelor of Science in Digital Media because, frankly, it was the only thing that I felt I was any good at the time. Now, enough of my sob story. This interest in tech and a mindset of solving problems led me to jobs in like tech support and web development, account management, project management, search engine optimization, and then eventually a tech startup that ultimately went bust, where I gained a solid interest and understanding of the scientific method. So when I joined this startup, we were executing on a waterfall project plan to launch our extremely convoluted product that no one wanted. Towards the end of this journey, we discovered Agile, we discovered the lean startup, and we actually started seeing some really great results. And then, of course, like a lot of startups, we ran out of money. But going through this painful journey of failure made me really fascinated with the scientific method. How do we prove and disprove our ideas about our product, about our users, how we work, and ultimately even ourselves? So after leaving the startup, I joined a UX and mobile dev agency in Sydney called Vivant, where I got to learn more about user research and human behavior. I also transitioned from being a product manager to being the Agile Coach for the company, trying to help the company evolve from being primarily a waterfall shop to being agile in how they build products, how they work together, and even how they work with clients. Understanding motivation and learning how to coach people was really fascinating to me. And I suppose subconsciously, I was probably just fascinated with psychology and human behavior because I wanted to know what made people tick. How can I work with that negative experience from my childhood, and why do people behave in such a way? I was drawn to the philosophy of Agile because it felt like a more humane approach to work. So I was generally attracted to technology, the scientific method, and just starting to appreciate psychology and human behavior. I could kind of sum up this mentality like this. Broadly speaking, this was my mindset. And frankly, there's a lot of value in it. If I could see you all, I would ask the question right now, does this resonate for anyone right here? What I loved about eventually getting a job at Spotify was that most people working at the company were humble seekers of truth, rather than kind of cocky purveyors of opinion. Perceivably, there were some that seemed to get promoted by being great bullshit artists, but I wasn't really gunning for a senior product role, so mostly it didn't really faze me. But generally speaking, I was not a fan of these kinds of people. I was good at taking a big idea, breaking it down into little pieces, and executing on it in like an unbiased way. What I wasn't good at was imagining a distant future. I wasn't good at telling stories. So after a few years working as a coach and learning about how to coach people and teams to become high performing, I got the itch to get back into a product role, and I landed a job in the client infrastructure tribe. So we were owning all of the infrastructure that powers our mobile and desktop client. I was working as a product owner for Spotify's desktop client infrastructure team. Our customers were other developers in the company, and my job was to adapt our infrastructure to their needs. They come up with a vision for their features, and I support them to achieve it. A perfect fit for my skills and experiences. I was still this nerdy PC gamer deep down. I kind of still am. So it was the perfect role. And actually, I think I was doing pretty well at it. I was getting good feedback from my stakeholders and from my team. Technically, Spotify's customers were also my customers, as we looked after some of the stability factors in the client, like crash reporting and performance. and some like features that are native to the operating system, like the play buttons on your keyboard and stuff like that. But for the most part, my focus was on other developers in the company. And this was going great for a while, and then this happened. We had a big reorg. And with this reorg came 3 really big changes. Firstly, this guy, Shiva, joined the company as the VP of Product for the entire Spotify consumer offering. One of the first messages he gave to all of the product owners was, "We need more storytellers." And I thought, not another bullshit artist. But the more I listened to him, the more open I was to his perspective. He wasn't like the other bullshit artists. He was humble, he was approachable, and actually inspiring, and seemed to listen to what us plebs on the ground had to say. But he also had some other things to say. He felt that, we were, as product owners, we were iterating too much in circles. He felt that, there weren't enough big ideas and innovation happening out in the feature teams. And not enough inspiring stories being told. So generally what he was trying to get across is your job is not to manage a backlog. Your job is to make sound product decisions through bold product strategy, articulated regularly through stories and validated through data and evidence. Oh, and so he was kind of a big deal, right? He came from like Twitter and YouTube. So, it piqued my curiosity. But then another big thing happened. This is Gustaf Söderström. He's was the chief product officer. Now he's head of research and development. And generally speaking, at this event that we ran every year or so called Product Days, he said, look, we need to focus less on delivery as product owners and more on strategy. And to couple this change, he said, actually, I'm going to change the name of the role. You're no longer product owners, you're product managers. Why? Well, to encourage a behavior shift, but to also help attract the right kind of talent. No longer were we iterating on a sort of centralized vision for the product that he had come up with. We had to come up with our own compelling visions for the product, aligned with the company strategy. We were now too big of a research and development organization for Gustaf to be able to get involved in everything that was going on. Now, at the time, if you had have asked me, I'd have said, product owners, product managers, it's the same role, right? In hindsight, I think I was totally wrong. So, this shift that happened saw the technology organization be expected to be more accountable for delivery so that product managers could focus more on strategy. And, with me being in my little infrastructure team, this wasn't such a big deal if it weren't for the fact for the third change. I went from being product owner of an infrastructure team to product manager of all of Spotify's desktop client for Mac and Windows, and unofficially Linux. So suddenly I'm at the helm of the second biggest platform at Spotify. And at the time, I was completely blown away and humbled that they would entrust me with so much responsibility. I had many stakeholders, a really big team, and we went from desktop around the company being like co-owned. So we looked after infrastructure, and then feature teams looked after each of their features that lived in the client, to one really big team owning the whole thing. So many features and a very complex application. My stakeholders were not only Spotify's customers, but also organizations from all across the company. Feature teams, for example, working on search, would want something from us. The ad platform team in New York, content in Stockholm, algorithmic in Boston, the new markets launches that want us to support different languages, the works. Desktop was the most feature-rich client, the oldest, and with the second highest number of users. My team went from about 8 or so co-located in Stockholm to something like 25 or so remotely distributed between Stockholm and Gothenburg, also in Sweden. So faced with this, I had two main priorities, two things to figure out. Firstly, I needed to motivate a bunch of feature developers from all over the company to be happy about joining my team and inspire them behind a compelling vision for the product. If I didn't, there's a good chance they'd simply just go and join another team. And many of them very easily could have done that because internal movement at the company wasn't something overly difficult to achieve. But secondly, and somewhat more importantly, I needed to come up with a product strategy for the desktop client. That is like the best thing for the company and for the platform, because if I didn't, someone else would, or lots of other people probably would. And then it kind of hit me. Maybe there's something to this storytelling thing. Maybe I can take a complex thing like product strategy for desktop and evangelize this in a simple way. Shit, I think I need to learn to tell stories. So I took a step back and I said, well, wait a second, why is it that someone like Shiva is saying, hey, we need more storytellers? First, I wanted to be clear about why this was an important thing to learn. So I started paying attention to Shiva's talks at the various internal forums. And I found myself captivated by how he spoke about the product. He was an amazing storyteller, but these weren't fairy tales. These were stories of how things are and how things could be. And generally, I wanted to support his vision for the product. So I asked Shiva and I asked some of the other product managers that I thought were good at this, tell me, why storytelling? Why is this a useful skill to have? Put simply, simplicity, inspiration, and influence. As a product manager, you likely hold all of the complexity of your product. Yet you need to simplify how you explain this to people to help create understanding. You also likely have zero positional power. You get things done by influence and inspiration. Yes, you have to get knee-deep in the details, into the data, into the company's strategy, and so on, but you need to be able to step out and tell that story simply. It takes too long to offload the complexity that you hold onto everyone. If you're a good PM, in my view, you're not the only one coming up with ideas for your product as well. So as humans, stories are how we make meaning in our lives. We tell stories whether we like it or not, and quite often to ourselves. Much of human psychology is centered around trying to change the stories we tell ourselves or let go of the ones that cease to serve us anymore. Stories are the language of meaning. And what is your job as a product manager? To rally people behind a purpose for your product. So, as a product manager, or really anyone in a role that relies on influence, you need to tell stories and ideally get better at it. You can tell a story with data, but data alone can't tell a story. As a product manager, you need to tell stories. So with this in mind, I came up with a product strategy and I tried to formulate it as a story. So what you're about to see is part of the story that I told to achieve the goals that I talked about before. Oh no, what's going on? Sorry, I lost my screen. Here we go. In order to energize my new team and get buy-in from stakeholders, very briefly, this is the story of Spotify's desktop client that I told. And you can tell it's a story because I'm calling it a tale of love, heartbreak, and new beginnings. Before I go any further, normally I would ask this to a group, but think about in your head, do any of you use Spotify's desktop client? And if so, when and how do you use it? Keep that in the back of your mind. So how did it start out? Well, I told the story of how desktop was the first and only Spotify client when the company launched. Desktop was Spotify. Spotify was desktop. Whoops. And then mobile came along. Desktop was how we acquired new users, and mobile was where we converted them to premium. So back then, you actually needed to pay Spotify to use their mobile application. So desktop was the free user acquisition funnel, and mobile was how we converted them to premium. But then a big thing happened. Then we launched Spotify free tier on mobile. We called it Shuffle tier at the time. And I told this story of how Spotify finally got the licenses to be able to offer free music on mobile. And this completely skyrocketed the company's user base and led to a strategic shift in the company. Suddenly now we were mobile first. And for a good reason. Mobile was where the growth of the company was happening. In our case, just in 1 year of having the mobile free tier, it went from obviously very few users to catching up to desktop. Then 1 year later, doubling the amount of users that desktop has. Growth for the company was exploding on mobile. So we made this decision to be mobile first. And what we'd hoped that meant was when we're coming up with new features, when we're thinking about how we're going to improve the product, we think about mobile first. However, this had a rather unfortunate side effect because frankly, mobile first kind of meant desktop last. And desktop ended up getting neglected subtly over the years. We ended up with fewer people working on the client because there was a rush to get a lot of the desktop developers to learn how to build mobile applications. And then there were these strange situations where beloved features weren't making it onto desktop for seemingly no good reason. And the way that I told this story was as if it was a marriage that fell apart. Mobile had found a new partner and we were left wondering where it all went wrong. The organizational policy was to develop features on mobile and desktop first, but the reality was that desktop was literally being forgotten by feature teams, either because it was not a priority, or in some cases, they didn't even have desktop feature developers. To my team, I used the analogy of a married couple having a baby together. The baby was our shared C++ library that handled the business logic for the client that powered both mobile and desktop. To the stakeholders, I spoke more so to the feature disparity and lack of attention we were giving to a very beloved platform. For example, you can see in this picture on the screen how the customer here talks about it being the full desktop application, and also how insanely poor the response was to their question. Basically, hey, you've delivered this amazing feature for mobile. Why isn't it on desktop? And the answer to that question is, well, because it's only on mobile. We were not particularly pleased with that answer. So going back to the marriage analogy, it was like we were having a midlife crisis. We needed to rediscover ourselves. And so this reorg happened, and suddenly we were all together in one team focused on what the hell do we do with desktop. Some in the team perceived this as a continued step in the wrong direction, that we were being downgraded to a tier 2 platform on par with other platforms that we build after mobile. So like smart speakers, TV, gaming consoles, and so on. But I saw this as a really awesome opportunity. We were now all together in the one team, and we could now decide what to do with this beloved platform. Yes, we were having a midlife crisis, but we now get the freedom and opportunity to rediscover ourselves. We're out of this abusive relationship, and we can finally rediscover ourselves. So with a little help from our data analysts, we dug into the data and asked the question, who are we now? And what do we stand for? So here's the answer. And it shouldn't come as a massive shock. We're an application that's in the background while you're at work or while you're studying. And you can see that I'm using data here, but it's in the context of a story being told. We could also see that apart from listening in the background, the client was being used to curate playlists and explore content, because it's much easier to do this on a PC or laptop than it is on your phone. Now, this probably seems really obvious to you, but there was no one whose responsibility it was to think about these things. So naturally, decisions weren't being made with this in mind. They were mostly being made as an afterthought. But most importantly of all, we learned the desktop has the highest retention rate of all of our platforms at Spotify. We didn't need to make desktop great again. It was already great. We needed to improve sign up and get it in the hands of more users. And this was a huge learning. So finally, I presented my plan for the product strategy. Given that we learned of the platform's stellar retention rate, I argued that actually the platform is already great and we don't need to improve it, we need to scale it. By this stage, the desktop client didn't even have the ability to sign up new users. This was crazy. Ultimately, we shifted from tweaking features to improving reliability, adding new languages to support new market launches, and partnering with Microsoft to get the Spotify app on the Windows Store, which in turn would lead them to a deal that we had with them where they would preload it on all new Windows 10 devices. And Microsoft were awesome partners and wanted to collaborate on this goal of scaling up our desktop user base. We knew from data that if our customers had the mobile application plus one other platform, they were way more likely to retain. So if we grew the desktop user base, we can not only improve retention, we might even be able to bring in new customers. This story of our past, our present, and our future rallied the team behind this new strategy. I'm proud to say that I managed to keep everyone in my team, at least for a while. And it rallied our stakeholders to support that strategy, including business development that worked with Microsoft. And importantly, I even showed a large chunk of this story to the folks at Microsoft, and it helped rally them behind our goals. As a part of the relationship that we had with them and telling this story, we even got Spotify on Xbox, which was something that customers had been asking for years. Now, I should also mention, you're probably looking at this photo and going, wow, that's rather inappropriate. We, as part of like evangelizing, this love and attention towards desktop, as a joke at the time, I got these hats made. And I should add that this was at a time when Donald Trump was just one of many Republican candidates. And we thought there's no way in hell this guy's actually going to become president. So it was a funny joke at the time, and we thought he was hilarious. Little did we know what was going to play out. So you won't see anyone wearing those hats anymore at Spotify. But broadly speaking, we went from this article you saw to this, where we got Spotify on the Windows Store. The press picked up on it, and the approach we took to putting it on the store and the installation process, and it was breaking new ground even for Microsoft at the time. And also you can see from this Twitter exchange, we retained the level of quality that customers had come to expect from the desktop client. So telling a complex story around why we should focus our time and energy on a neglected application with great potential helped us push for what we wanted with Microsoft and not budge on concerns of quality, for example. It also helped us maintain our staffing for the team and keep up the high quality of experience that our customers had come to expect. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering, okay, well, that sounds cool, but how do I do this? How do I tell great stories if you're new to this? What are some tools? Well, I'm glad you asked. The first one is called the Storytelling Canvas. This is really helpful to help you get started and frame your basic assumptions and structure of your story. You can get it from brucey.com.au. Pretty cool that it's from an Australian company. If you search for Storytelling Canvas, I'm sure you'll find it. Another tool is called the fish model. The way that the fish model works is you start with a hook, so something to capture people's attention. Usually something controversial, contrarian, a fascinating fact, what's going to make people go, oh, that's interesting, tell me more. Then you go to the head of the fish. Who are you and why are you here and what makes you qualified to talk on the topic? Then you got the body. So 3 major points to make your case. It's the body of your story. One thing to think about when thinking about your 3 main points is there are different approaches you can take to convincing people of something. So you can be very dry and talk about data and analysis. You can tug at people's heartstrings and try to go for an emotional approach. And I can't remember what the other one was, but it's helpful to think about the different ways that people get persuaded and how can you talk to those different methods. You then have the end of your body. So this is not the end of the fish. And you can say something along the lines of, well, now I know what you might be thinking. And, your job is to think about what might people have in their head where they might be disagreeing with an argument you're trying to make. And how can you raise that and identify it so that people can go, okay, cool. I've got my concern answered. And then finally, there's the tail of the fish. So you summarize your points, you loop back to the hook. If maybe they haven't figured out what that was, if it was something kind of mysterious, and then finish with some sort of call to action. Here's what I want you to do, or here's how I want you to think, or something along those lines. Then you have something called that I don't know if there's really a good name for, but I just call it the basic story structure. And this is like kind of a narrative format that's pretty much common in most stories. So you start with an opener. What's your story about? In the case of this presentation, in the case of the Spotify presentation, I was talking about who I am and the topic, and I gave you some history of my upbringing in this. Yeah. The incident for me was the reorg. So an incident that changes everything, some sort of pivotal event. Then you have a series of crises that build tension. So a logical progression of events that build towards the next step. In my case, they were realizing that I needed to give up my disdain for storytelling and think that it's only for bullshit artists. And then you have a climax. So everything appears hopeless. Sorry, I've mixed this up. The crises would be, for me, I suddenly now need to motivate a team and sell a product strategy. How do I do that? The climax would be what I just said. So shite, I have to give up. I have to, deal with my disdain for storytelling and perhaps learn how to do this. And then the final part is the end of the story. So how did you overcome this adversity and, succeed towards some sort of goal? So in my case, that was learning about storytelling and using it to achieve my goals. And then finally, it's not really a structure, but it is a technique that you can use and you can practice, and that is picture language. So you may remember me talking about my product as a person that has just left a marriage or a relationship. And through me doing this, you might start to imagine a picture in your head. I was using picture language. So it's less about a structure and more about a means to convey a story, using people's imagination as a tool to evoke connection to the story and a problem to be solved. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, my product is kind of like a Toyota Camry. And this was actually the first, not exactly this photo, but this is the first car I owned, which was a bright yellow Toyota Camry. So you might say, you know what, our product is kind of like a 90s Toyota Camry. It's very reliable, a little outdated, and, could be improved. There's modern technology now. But, it's cheap and people go to it when they want a reliable car, but not when they want to feel a rush or use the latest technology. I want to change that. Or you could say, you know what, our product's kind of like an old Porsche. People still love these cars, and you can still probably pay a lot of money for them and will flock to own one. But it's going to break down pretty soon. So here's something that you can try after this talk, if you like. I'm guessing maybe not tonight, but when you're back at work, grab a peer and tell the story of your product through some sort of analogy like this. And so finally, some final thoughts. Take a moment and think about, have you watched a film or a documentary recently and you've come out of it wanting to do something different in your life as a result of watching that film or documentary? So for example, when I watched the recent Michael Jordan documentary on Netflix, all I wanted to do was go out and shoot some hoops, as I hadn't done that in years. The story provoked me to action because it inspired me. If I were to summarize my experience here, it's that being data informed and telling great inspiring stories are not mutually exclusive. Stories help us simplify complexity and inspire people behind a vision that appeals to our fundamental psychology as humans. It brings out the creativity and motivation in people. So you might be wondering how this story ends. So after Spotify, I ended up working as a chief product officer for a mental health startup in Stockholm, in Sweden, called 29K, where I got to combine my love for product development, product management, with my interest in psychology and my desire to help people and do something good for the world. It's an amazing free product. If you're interested in personal growth, I highly recommend checking them out. They're funded by rich philanthropists in Sweden. There's absolutely no commercial gain from that particular product, and it's called 29K. After that, I moved back to Australia, where I'm from. You might hear a bit of a strange accent. It's been bastardized a little bit from living in Sweden, where I now work as an org and a product coach for Organa, a consulting company where we have no managers, no business owners. We are 4 consultants that are really passionate about helping companies grow their agile org design and product capability. And, if you think I might be able to help add value to organization, I'd love to chat, and my details are on the screen. And that's it. I believe, I'm not sure if we do Q&A, Ben, but I'm sure you'll jump back into this.
Yes, we are. Well, first of all, Brendan, thank you so much for sharing. This has been really, really awesome. If you're sitting at home, if you enjoyed this, please give a little bit of a clap. It's not awkward. But no, this has been, we talked about it a little bit before. It's been such a really fascinating insight into a product that I think most of us have used, and quite a story that you told around it. And really practical insights as well. I'll stop sharing the slides. Now, everyone on the stream, just put your questions right into the chat on YouTube. We'll field them here, and we've got Brendan for a little while longer. Let's see when we run out of questions. I'm gonna start with one. I'm really curious to hear, like you mentioned how Shiva and others inspired you towards to sort of look into storytelling. What were some of the stories, either from your childhood, maybe, of from outside of your professional life, or from stories that Shiva told, or that you heard elsewhere in Spotify or other jobs that you had? What were some of the stories that really resonated with you and that inspired you?
Yeah, I'll go back to the Michael Jordan inspiration, actually. As a kid, I really loved the fact that he became so insanely good at something, which was basketball. And then all of a sudden he's like, you know what? Actually, I kind of want to play baseball. And then he quit the Chicago Bulls and he went off and played baseball, which was hugely inspiring for me. Like someone that had reached the pinnacle of success in their field and went, you know what, I'm kind of done with that for a while. I'm going to go off and do something completely different where I'm actually not particularly good at it. So that has probably stuck with me massively throughout my life, and perhaps why I've held so many different roles and love Agile so much, I suppose, when I got into it, because it was like finally like a mindset around adapting to your needs or the needs of the customer or whatever that might be. That's
awesome. And you actually touched on a really interesting point there. personally, I remember product seemed like one of these careers and jobs where you actually never stop learning. And I see a lot of people, a lot of sports people who just really master the game. They end up at the top, and it feels like product. It's just there doesn't seem to be a top. There's always something else that you can learn, always a new challenge that you can tackle, and maybe it's partly driven by companies always trying to grow to that next level. So question for you would be, what's next? What's next after product, after storytelling?
In what sense? What do you mean? What's next?
How do we? How would you take your own career to the next level after everything you've been through, and after you've mastered storytelling? What are the next skills that you're sort of working towards?
Yeah. So if you hadn't noticed already, I'm quite passionate about psychology and personal growth. I spend some time volunteering at a personal growth retreat. So my eventual goal, which is probably years and years and years away, I would love to combine some of the most sort of cutting edge, progressive, psychology-based tools with leadership development in a way that brings a group of leaders together and gets them to be extremely vulnerable with each other in a way that would have ripples of effects across an organization. The closest thing I can think of to someone doing that would be Brené Brown. I think it's amazing what she's doing in highlighting the importance of people being vulnerable with one another, and where that she talks about it being the birthplace of creativity and innovation. And I would love to bridge the worlds of business and psychology and therapy. I think that would be amazing, but I'm so far away from that, but I'd love to learn.
That's awesome. And Brené Brown is actually a really good call that leads us into our first questions from the audience. Brené Brown has written a few good books. You already recommended a few frameworks. Any books that you can recommend on storytelling or any other materials that you've seen around?
I'm a little embarrassed to say that I've not read a single book on how to tell great stories. Everything that I learned that I shared in this presentation has been something that I kind of just sought out on the interwebs, and part of like leadership training that I did at Spotify that's probably proprietary and living somewhere. So yeah, I wish I could tell you a good book to recommend. But what I can say is, frankly, I don't think you need a book. I don't think you need a lot of tools at all to be able to start practicing telling stories, which is why my favorite one out of the ones that I shared was the picture language one. It's one of the simplest ways to talk about an opportunity or a problem in a way that's interesting and inspiring and gets people thinking and doesn't make it overly complicated. So, I mean, just practice it. Like, buddy up with someone that also wants to learn and have a crack at, like, okay, so we've got 3 minutes to tell the story about something. You go first, sort of thing. So yeah, I can really recommend trying that.
Awesome. Alrighty. Now we've got another one here. I don't know if you can comment at all on the story brand framework, if you heard that at all.
I haven't. Maybe you're teaching me something now. That's cool.
Well, we might have a look afterwards, but all right, shout out for that. Now, about your go-to sort of killer feature of a good story. I don't know if all the frameworks, like there's sort of one thing you would highlight that's sort of the silver bullet.
Every story has conflict, so I think there's always a central piece of conflict or adversity that someone has to overcome. So I think incorporating that into your story is pretty important. It's pretty central to basically every story that is out there, I would say.
Awesome. And that leads us almost nicely to the next question, which is what's sort of the conflict that a product manager has to experience to get into storytelling, or rather, like, at what stage of product development would you think storytelling is probably going to be something that can unlock that?
Anytime you need to get buy-in, I would say, for something, whether it's direct buy-in, like I need you to make a decision, or if it's indirect buy-in, I just need to keep people happy and jazzed and motivated behind, even if it's just a stakeholder going, good stuff, like keep doing what you're doing. Buy-in would be my answer to that, for sure. And honestly, that's kind of part of the job, regardless of how early on in your career you are, right? Like, if you think about the fundamentals of a product team, you want to build something in a good way. You want to make sure you're building the right thing, and you want to make sure you've got some good inspect and adapt loops going on. But when it comes to, are we building the right thing? Yes, you rely on data and so on, but ultimately, usually someone's paying for you and your team to do what you're doing, and in order to at least keep that process going, you need to motivate them and inspire them behind what you're doing. And in my view, one of the best ways of doing that is through telling a story, no matter how simple that story is. Again, I want to just stress, like, backing up what you're saying with evidence is extremely important. And you need both. But I'm a big fan of, using storytelling as a way to kind of drive it home, or wrap it up in a nice kind of bow where people go, oh, okay, I get it now. Because not everyone is going to understand complicated, data analysis or graphs or so on, especially with like time poor stakeholders.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, the next question is from Anthony, who's wondering, for the product managers that came after you and sort of learned and adopted sort of storytelling, what was the aha moment for them to think, I need to get better at that?
I don't know. I suppose it's kind of a groundswell of seeing other people do it, and seeing the reactions that they get from others around them, and going, wow, actually that's kind of cool. How do I do that? One thing that some of the C-suite used to do at Spotify a lot back in the day, before Google and Apple had even put out music products, is they would refer to them as the dragon heads. So we needed to slay this giant dragon with like big dragon heads. And, one of them was Google, one of them was Apple. I think one of them was Amazon at the time. And, how do we go about slaying the dragon, right? Because they had so much more money than us at Spotify. So all we can do is build a better product than them, because they might turn around and just slash the price of their services, and then suddenly we have to compete with a cheaper product that we can't afford to slash our prices. So, they would use storytelling as a way of saying, our primary focus is, what was the words they would use? It was like indefensible product differentiation. So how do we always stay one step ahead of our competitors by building a superior product and innovating? And this was through the lens of this storytelling of like, this dragon's going to like breathe fire at us. So we need to be prepared for that. So that was kind of a cool storytelling technique that I saw them use. And I was probably inspired by it at the time. I just didn't realize that was actually a skill you could learn and use.
Awesome. Now let's move from storytelling sort of into broader things that might have come out of your Spotify career and now also your life as a consultant. Any predictions that you would make about the future of music, the future of desktop, the future of mobile? Anything that other product managers should have a think about?
I do believe that it's only a matter of time. I've left the company, so I can say this publicly now. I do believe it's probably only a matter of time before music labels become a lot more redundant than they are these days. Artists give away a lot of percentage of their revenue to them. And back in the day, that made a lot of sense because they owned distribution. But they don't own distribution really anymore, other than that they kind of go, well, thanks for the music, and I'm just going to pass this on to Spotify now, and then Spotify distribute it. So cutting out the middleman, I assume, is probably a trend we'll see.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a disruption that's coming to a lot of industries at the moment. Now I know you, having worked at Spotify, it's unavoidable that you get asked about the Spotify model every once in a while of working, just like people who've worked at Atlassian get asked about Jira quite a bit. So. Any comments from you on the famous Spotify model? What worked, what didn't, and now when you go into companies, what do you replicate and think actually a company can benefit from this aspect?
So I'm mostly just going to mirror what like a lot of the coaches that worked at Spotify have been saying for years and years and years, which is there's kind of no such thing as a Spotify model. At the time, it was it was a couple of coaches at the company saying, here's what we're doing and what we aspire to do. And part of it is aspects of organizational design based on a lot of context and reasons at the time that made a lot of sense. So back to what I was saying before about innovation and constantly staying ahead of your competitors, if Daniel Ek is the person that has to come up with all the ideas for the product, it's not going to work. Like, he's only one man. But if you have every single team at the company thinking about how to best improve their part of the product, then that's how you end up with Discover Weekly, for example, which was created out of like a few people in a team that had a similar mission to what Discover Weekly is about, going, hey, we've got this kind of weird idea. Let's go off and try it out for a while and test it out on our employees. And a fun fact is that at the time, Daniel hated the idea, which is hilarious. And he said, if it were up to me, I wouldn't fund this. But he didn't want to mess with the model. And he said, okay, like, do your thing. Sure. I'm not giving you any more people to work on this, but go ahead and try it out. And so they did. And it became one of the most successful features of the company. I do believe in the fundamental idea that people responsible for your growth also being responsible for the specifics of what you work on is really tricky to do. And it's kind of easier to separate those two concerns. And I would say that's at the heart of what the Spotify model really is about separating competency growth with product decision-making and direction, for example, and enabling some of the really fundamental aspects of the Agile manifesto in some ways. What I can say is it was great at empowering teams, but then as Spotify grew and grew and got bigger and bigger, it became really difficult to execute on really big, large-scale company-wide initiatives. And so some of us would go to conferences and talks, and we would say, actually, we suck at doing big company-wide projects. We're not good at it at all. So all of those things are trade-offs. And so if you are to take inspiration from the Spotify model, like, nothing wrong with that, but make sure you're doing it because you have a problem that you want to solve, and you're realizing that it's a conscious trade-off. So there will be things that you will be worse at as a result of getting better at something because you chose a particular way of working. And I know that kind of sounds like common sense, but a lot of companies that adopt some of these ways of working aren't thinking that way about it. And it's really unfortunate because there is a lot of value in it. It's just that you need to really take it step by step and go, okay, we have this problem we want to solve, or this opportunity. How do we organize ourselves around it so that we're effective? And what we used to do at Spotify is we would go out and visit other companies and chat to them about how they're working and go, wow, can this help us solve a particular problem that we have? And we would bring it back and only use what we felt was helpful to us. So like a really good example of that is there's this entire massive framework called Sociocracy 3.0. And it's kind of similar to holacracy and this sort of flat management structures. And so some of us went off and, including myself, went off and took a course on sociocracy. And there's a lot going on in that model. And yet we took a couple of little things about it and used it and found success with that and basically ignored the rest. So one example of that is particularly in Sweden, there's a real culture of needing consensus. Everyone has to agree on a decision that we're going to make. And it's kind of quite at odds with the more perhaps American style of like one manager is going to make a decision, then everyone else has to follow. And whilst that's great at having people feel included and feel empowered, it makes for very slow decision making. So one thing that we picked from sociocracy was this concept of consent-based decision making. So anyone can kind of make a decision if it's small enough to try and safe enough to fail. And then we'll go ahead with it unless someone objects. An objection is, this is going to harm my ability to do my job, or this flies in the face of our company values. Unless your objection is that strong, it's not an objection, it's just feedback. And so we introduced this model for decision making, and we tried it out in one part of the company. We didn't just all of a sudden go, this is how we're making decisions now. And we tried it out and we found some success with it. And then we started talking to other tribes going, hey, we're finding some success with this way of making decisions. Maybe you want to try it too, and here's how it works. So I would encourage people to think that way about these things in general, not just Spotify.
Yeah, awesome. And that does lead me into my last question, and then we should wrap it up. One of the interesting paradigms you've been exposed to is sort of having multiple clients, right? With desktop and mobile. And what you've talked about was mobile was sort of starting to steam ahead in some ways, and had features that didn't then make it to desktop. And I do remember that Facebook had a similar problem, just the other way around. That the web teams were building features and they never made it to mobile. I think the head of mobile at the time essentially made the decision that the mobile team shall be abandoned, and that each product team is responsible themselves for always making sure that there's parity as far as possible between what they're building on web and what they're building on mobile. And I believe, although I might be lying here, some of the decisions to have React and React Native with very different paradigms came out of that today. So some of the technologies that we're using, because it enables teams to use the same technologies for multiple different platforms.
Yeah.
Having lived in that paradigm, and I don't know what if Spotify ultimately went down a similar route or tried different angles. When you think about the teams that you work with today, what are the factors that you would take into consideration to determine how a team should be set up in a sort of multi-platform world?
What a long question. Let me think about this. I think it depends on the level of priority and size of the user base of the platform relative to the others at the company. So I suppose also the technical complexity of such a platform.
I'm sorry, I might have overcomplicated the question for you.
So I would say, like, so for example, a really recent one that happened after I left, that the wheels in motion were happening while I was there, was the Spotify web player and the desktop client were completely different code bases. They're now rolling out that they'll be the same because they're both built on a web-based front end. And so I think just bringing it back to what's your biggest problem to be solved, and are you optimized and organized to solve it? So I think, so I can kind of give a sort of a somewhat relevant example. When I was owning the infrastructure layer of the desktop client before I took over the whole thing, the web player was the player that was being neglected the most. And some higher ups made the decision to just give my team the web player. And at the time, it made no sense. It was like, my customers are developers within the company for the most part. And the web player is a user-facing application that primarily is used by people that can't install software. So they're people that are in office jobs where they don't have administrator rights to install software, so they use it through the web. And so I kept bringing it back to what's our product thinking, product-minded opinion on what we want to do with this thing, and then let's decide what to do with it. So I took it upon myself to kind of go, well, okay, I can't change the fact that it lives with my team now, but what I can do is help talk to the right people to figure out what should we do with it and how do we organize people around that. And so where we ended up landing was, yes, it serves that reason for being of people that can't install software. But the reality is that the biggest opportunity for that as a platform was to bring in new users, because there's so many people on the web that are going to Google Spotify or Google some music, and then we're going down a rabbit hole of like, how do we get people playing music before they've even created an account? And there are all these really interesting business problems to solve that we could potentially solve through a web player, but there's no team with that mission to solve it. So, to me, it's like, start there. And then eventually there was a team that owned it. And then that team and my team, we got together and go, well, does it really make sense to solve both of our problems with completely different user bases? We can actually save the company a whole bunch of money, user bases, web-based architectures, put it that way. We could probably save a lot of money and simplify a lot of development workflow by combining the two code bases. So a decision was made to basically build a new and improved web player and then eventually merge it in with the desktop client and achieve roughly similar feature parity. So it's like, what problem are you trying to solve? But start with the user problem first, right? Because at first it was the user problem. It was like, well, why do we have this damn thing in the first place? What problem does it solve for the user, and what problem does it solve for the company? Let's solve that first and rally around that. Now that we've rallied around that, we can then go, okay, well, what are our running, operating problems, costs, challenges? Is this working out for us? How do we solve that? But start with the user, then the business, then like technical complexity and all that sort of stuff. I have no idea if I answered your question, but that was my best effort.
No. That's I asked a very convoluted question, and now it's you bring it back to the to first principles at the end of the day, and I think that is so often the right decision for many of the things that we do as product managers. So no, perfect. Thank you so much. We've asked enough of you today, Brendan. Thank you so much, and Eddie has lots of questions for 7 p.m. local time. So we're going to wrap it up. Again, thank you so much, Brendan. Really happy that you were able to join us. And now what's left for us to do is talk very briefly about the next meetup. Thank you, Brendan. We'll see you soon, I hope. cut him off a little bit too early there. Sorry, Brendan. All right, next Product Tank meetup. We've got a date and a speaker and a topic, which is the 26th of May. So in about a month. A cadence of meetup should increase again from here on. And we're going to talk about UX and product with Sophie Tobin, Chief Experience Officer from Mabel. And one of the phrases I love using is, you want healthy tension between teams? And I'm very happy that Sophie is going to talk exactly about that, healthy tension between UX and product to create the best possible outcomes. That's it for tonight. Thank you everyone for joining, and sign up on the Product Tank meetup page for the event on the 26th. And I look forward to seeing you then. Have a good night.